Climate change. You've probably heard that it has something to do with the Earth warming, fossil fuels and CO2, and you might have heard that it's something we don't really have to worry about, or that it's an existential threat to our planet. In this series, we're going to look at what the science tells us about how our climate is changing, why the climate is changing, and what the effects of a changing climate are today and may be in the future. In this video in particular, we're going to look at the causes of global climate change. The Earth is warming, and in 2020 the average global temperature was more than 1.2 degrees Celsius or almost 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in the latter half of the 19th century. The current global temperature possibly exceeds any temperature in the last 100,000 years, and it's currently changing at a pace far faster than anything seen in the past 65 million years. So how did the planet warm like this in such an unprecedented manner? Well, it's because of something called the greenhouse effect. Here we have the Earth, and around it is the atmosphere made up of gases that are kept close to Earth by gravity. These gases include nitrogen and oxygen, as well as a small amount of something called greenhouse gases, like water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. When the sun sends heat to Earth, it goes through the atmosphere down to the surface, where it is absorbed by Earth and then radiated back to space. But greenhouse gases like CO2 in the atmosphere absorb this heat exiting Earth and holds onto it for a short while before radiating the heat back out in a random direction, either at the Earth's surface, into space, or into another greenhouse molecule, which then repeats this process. Because of these greenhouse gases, heat from the sun stays in the atmosphere for longer and warms up the Earth. And the more greenhouse gases there are, the hotter the Earth gets. This is known as the greenhouse effect. In fact, if we didn't have the greenhouse effect, the Earth would be around minus 18 degrees Celsius or around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and we would all be dead. Since the Industrial Revolution, the levels of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have all increased in the atmosphere, which has increased the greenhouse effect and the global temperature. We can actually measure the amount of heat greenhouse gases trap in the atmosphere, and for years, the Earth has been trapping more and more heat. Not all greenhouse gases are equally as good at trapping heat. In fact, CO2 is one of the worst at it. The other major greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, trap more heat than CO2. A single molecule of methane has the potential to trap 28 times as much heat as a single molecule of CO2. And a single nitrous oxide molecule traps 265 times as much heat as a single molecule of CO2. There is also another category of greenhouse gases called fluorinated gases, which are made only via human activities, such as industrial processes. Fluorinated gases are extremely potent. For example, the gas CFC12 is more than 10,000 times as potent as CO2. So why do people talk about CO2 as the bad guy when there are all these other gases that are way better at trapping heat? Well, it's simply because there is way more CO2 in the atmosphere compared to all of these other greenhouse gases, as you can see here. Even when accounting for the fact that some gases are more potent than others, CO2 still accounts for 3/4 of all global greenhouse emissions. So why is the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere increasing? It's because of human activity, mainly the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels like coal, oil and natural gas are burnt to create energy. Fossil fuels are millions of year-old dead plants and animals. All life forms are made of carbon, and therefore when fossil fuels are burnt, they release CO2 into the atmosphere. You might reasonably ask, how do we know it's our fossil fuel emissions that are increasing CO2 levels? Here's how we know. Not all carbon in the atmosphere is the same. Almost all of it is something called carbon-12, and a small amount is carbon-13. But the carbon in plants has way less carbon-13 than the atmosphere has. Fossil fuels also have less carbon-13 compared to the atmosphere, like the plants they were made out of. As we burn fossil fuels, the CO2 we emit has more carbon-12 relative to carbon-13 compared to the CO2 in the atmosphere. What all this means is that if fossil fuels really are increasing CO2 levels, then that would mean that the amount of carbon-13 in the atmosphere would be going down. And sure enough, carbon-13 has been decreasing ever since we started measuring it. In 2020, humans emitted around 34.1 gigatons of fossil-related CO2. This was a slight drop from 2019, mainly because of the pandemic and lockdowns. Emissions of CO2 in the 21st century have mainly been from coal, oil and gas, but some has also been emitted from the production of cement and other activities. If we want to see which kind of fossil fuel is the worst, we have to look at how much CO2 is emitted compared to how much energy is made when they are burnt. Coal is by far the worst, no matter which type of coal you look at. Diesel and fuel oil are right behind coal, and natural gas falls at the bottom of the list. We here in the US have actually been the worst for the climate. In 2020, we emitted 4.6 gigatons of fossil-related CO2. This means that the US emitted around 13.5% of global emissions in 2020. If we look back in history, we have emitted a quarter of all fossil-related CO2 ever released into the atmosphere. The closest country, China, are only responsible for 14% of historical CO2 emissions. So let's look at where all of these emissions in the US come from. After accounting for differences in potency, 80% of the US greenhouse gas emissions come from CO2, higher than the global average. The transportation sector makes up almost 30% of US greenhouse gas emissions, closely followed by electricity production. The agricultural sector, which only accounts for around 10% of total US emissions, is still responsible for 80% of nitrous oxide emissions and almost 40% of methane emissions, which, as you'll remember, are both very potent gases. The energy we Americans use every day comes mainly from fossil fuels, and only 21% comes from clean energy sources like solar, wind or nuclear power, which emit very few greenhouse gases. So far we've mostly looked at the greenhouse gases emitted from fossil fuels, but there is also another major source of CO2 emissions. That is deforestation. Forests currently cover 30% of all land on Earth, and there are more than 3 trillion trees on Earth. But humans have been cutting trees down. During photosynthesis, trees take in CO2 and store it. When trees are destroyed, they will no longer be able to trap more CO2 inside of them, and the CO2 they already have stored up will be returned into the atmosphere. In 2020, the Earth lost almost 26 million hectares of forest, which is equal to the size of the United Kingdom or the state of Wyoming. In just the past 50 years, around 20% of the Amazon rainforest, the largest forest in the world, has been destroyed. Since the start of human civilization, we have decreased the number of trees on Earth by almost 50%. Today, most forest loss is due to farming, the raising of livestock, mining and drilling, as well as wildfires and urbanization. Deforestation in the Amazon rainforest is mainly due to cattle ranching and the farming of soybeans. When we add deforestation on top of fossil-related CO2 emissions, we can see that the world emitted 40 gigatons of CO2 in 2020, and that 15% of those emissions came from deforestation. All the CO2 we released in 2020 weighs as much as 8 billion elephants, 364 million blue whales, or almost 7,000 Great Pyramids of Giza. If we put all the different emissions together and account for differences in potency, we released the equivalent to almost 55 gigatons of CO2 in 2018. In summary, the Earth's climate has been changing at an unprecedented rate due to human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. Through these processes, we have increased the amount of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases in our atmosphere, which has led to increased trapping of heat via the greenhouse effect. Though our emissions of these greenhouse gases slightly decreased in 2020 due to the pandemic, there is no certainty that they won't just rise again as we return to a more normal world and economy. Thank you for watching our first video on global climate change. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it and want to see more, and we hope to see you another time.